welcome to some more questions and answers here on the Old Front Line. These are questions submitted by you, the podcast listeners, and each month we select some of the best questions that have been submitted via email and the Discord server to answer here and hopefully give us all fresh perspectives and new knowledge of this vast subject of the Great War. So let's begin. I've continued my journey across the Old Front Line in recent weeks with trips to the Hindenburg Line and the Somme and in Flanders, but recently I was on the battlefields of the next Great War, of the Second World War, looking at the fighting in the Netherlands and in Germany in those final months, from the breakout battles in the Netherlands through to the crossing of the Rhine and the final actions of April and May of 1945 leading up to Victory in Europe Day, VE Day, which of course is the 80th anniversary of that this year. And over the years of working as a battlefield guide, being equally as interested in the Second World War as the First, I've of course travelled to many of those battlefields with veterans of that conflict in the same way that I did with veterans of the Great War all those years ago. And of course that kind of journey makes me think about veterans of both those great conflicts. But as with the crisscross paths of the Great War, which we discover by walking and travelling that landscape of the Western Front, I kind of also find that there are crisscross pathways between those two world wars in so many ways. So being on a recce for a tour looking at World War II, travelling through Germany, one of the things that I find are war memorials. And I was in the town of Celle, where there is a very nice war memorial to one of the local regiments with a Stahlhelm, a steel helmet on it, in a big kind of circular memorial. I've been there before, but I found a new one this time. When we were looking for somewhere to park our coach, they've put a First World War German artillery memorial on a plinth in the car park there. No idea what regiment it commemorates, nothing on it to say that. And it's certainly not been there before, so where it's come from I don't know. But it's all part, I guess, of that discovery of this subject that so engages us and fascinates us. And I guess that brings us to the heart of what these Q&A sessions are about. So let's get down to this week's questions. Our first question comes from John on email. I heard you talk about Edmund Blunden's book Undertones of War in a recent podcast where he talks about the Hun, but I've heard other names for the Germans in the First World War, the Bosch or Fritz. I was wondering if you know where these names come from. I believe by the Second World War they had become Jerrys or Krauts. I seem to recall that British soldiers were simply known to the Germans as Tommies. Is that so? Well, that's a good follow-on from me talking about travelling across Germany recently and seeing German war memorials from the First World War. Well, these kind of names, if you look at the history of military history of warfare, you will see that sides give each other names, mostly unfavourable names, I would say. And in the First World War, you see a whole number of names being brought into the early propaganda of the conflict that really kind of stylise how the Germans as a nation are portrayed within this propaganda and then seen by a wider public and then understood by soldiers on the battlefield. And all of the names that you mentioned there, John, from the Hun through to the Bosch, Fritz, and those ones that you think are from the Second World War, Jerrys and Krauts, are all part of that language that not just the soldiers but the general population used to describe the enemy. So if we look at a few of them and think about where they come from, Hun is the most obvious one. The use of the name Hun for Germans goes back centuries, I guess, before the Great War, because it was a name given to the German-speaking tribes that lived in that part of kind of Central and towards Eastern Europe. And you see them being referenced as such going way back. I mean, I'm not an expert on Roman history, but certainly that is something that we would associate with that period of military history, with the Romans battling the Hunnish tribes in what is today modern Germany. but it's certainly a phrase that you see being used following the creation of Germany, coming together in that conflict of the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 71, and one that is picked up pretty early on in British propaganda and in the British press to describe the new enemy, to describe Germany in 1914. There's that old phrase, you can't trust the Hun, for example, which we see not just used in contemporary records, but later in comedy about the First World War, most notably Blackadder, which kind of brings together this kind of language in that most famous sideways look at the First World War. So that's the Hun. That's an obvious one, I think. Bosch, well, I think many believe that this is something to do with the Bosch company, but actually, in fact, it's a derivation of a French word, caboche, which means thickhead, blockhead, that kind of thing, and is also linked to the use of the word squarehead to describe German soldiers. You see this whole categorising of the enemy in 1914 and a dehumanisation of the enemy, trying to create monsters out of them, which is something that's certainly how they're portrayed in 1914 propaganda, with the Hun, with Bosch, with squareheads bayoneting prisoners and nuns and crucifying kittens on church doors. I mean, all of that kind of stuff that was very common in that early war period. So that's Bosch, that's where that comes from, actually a French word. Fritz, well, that is also fairly obvious when you look at the history, or you know something about the history of Germany long before the First World War, because Frederick is a very common name in Germany, which is shortened to Fritz, and one of the most famous Fritzes was Frederick the Great of Prussia, der Alte Fritz, incredible man, someone who's fascinated me for many, many years, and I think is part of the pathway to the First World War in the way that he took Prussia from being a fairly small nation to becoming an incredibly powerful military nation, stamping its feet all the way across parts of Europe during his lifetime. So Fritz, and that is one of the most common soldiers' names for the German soldier in the Great War, comes from Old Fritz. And if you ever go to Berlin and go down the Unter den Linden, you'll see a statue of him there, and many other memorials in other places besides. And when I think back to talking to veterans in the 80s and 90s, and we got on to talking about the enemy, because I would ask them about their enemy, the Germans on the other side of no man's land, Fritz is a phrase that they would say all the time. Well, Fritz was holding this trench just above the Thiepval Ridge. We could see Fritz from the edge of Thiepval Wood. Or I could hear Fritz, when I remember when I'm saying this, I could hear Fritz just across no man's land. Old Fritz, we knew he was there because he was gabbing away, and we could hear them having conversations about who knows what. So that was a really common description of the enemy, Fritz. Now, John, you say you think Jerry's and Krauts comes from World War II, and it was extensively used in World War II. Again, when I kind of think of World War II veterans that I took across some of the battlefields we were talking about right at the beginning of the podcast, they would refer to old Jerry. They'd say, well, old Jerry was holding this river just outside this town, just within Nazi Germany, and he put up a hell of a fight there. And old Jerry was on this hill, and he was occupying this position close to a main road, and things like that. So Jerry's and Krauts, very much the latter being used by American troops, very much World War II terms, but actually they come from the Great War. Kraut was an American Expeditionary Force term used in 1918 to describe the Germans, and was part of an American language they brought with them, because if you look at the history of America in the 19th century, there were a lot of German immigrants who ate sauerkraut, and they were often referred to within America as kraut. So that was a term the Americans brought with them in the Great War that was used then much more extensively in the next Great War. Jerry's also, as you've thought to be a more common World War II phrase, in fact, was also one used in the First World War, and that one refers to a kind of derivation of German. So Germans, Jerry's, it kind of comes from that. So all these names, they have their background, many of them used really as kind of diatribe within propaganda, but then phrases like Fritz and Jerry, there's almost a kind of fondness when I think back to some of these veterans describing Fritz across no man's land, less so with the World War II generation, but that's a subject for another podcast and another day. But they are very much part of the soldiers' language of that period and continue to be used. I remember when I lived on the Somme, talking to some of the older French generations there, they would still refer to the Germans as les Boches, often les sales Boches, the dirty Germans, and that was not said with any kind of fondness whatsoever. And just to kind of finish off with your reference to British soldiers, so if we cross no man's land and go to the Germans and how they described the British and Commonwealth soldiers, they called all of them, whether they were British, Australian, Canadian, whatever, they called them Der Tommies. And you actually see the phrase Der Tommies being used in German war diaries, intelligence reports, official documents, all kinds of things. And you see it being used again in the Second World War as well. So that was their kind of phrase for us. And of course that comes from Thomas Atkins, the apocryphal name for the archetypal British soldier, suggested, it is said, by the Duke of Wellington, immortalised by Rudyard Kipling in his poetry, and probably the whole kind of naming and history behind Thomas Atkins, Tommy Atkins, is another podcast for another day. I've managed to promise two, as it were, in just this one answer to this first question. So I hope that kind of sheds a bit of light on these phrases. And there is a darker side to these names, of course, but like I say, Fritz, the way some of the old vets used to talk about Fritz on the other side of no man's land, it's clear they had a great respect for the men that they fought and the men that they captured in battle and the men that they got to meet in no man's land in some cases, either on the Christmas truce of 1914, which some of the men that I interviewed did, or under somewhat more difficult circumstances at different points in the war. So a great question, John. Thanks for that. Let's move on to question number 2, and this one comes from James, also on email. Following on from the question about empire memorials and participation, could you elaborate the role Portugal played on the Western Front? I confess that before I immersed myself in the First World War, since following your podcast, I had no idea that Portugal was even involved in the Great War. Did they have a notable action, or do they have memorials worth visiting? Do they have their own cemeteries? And are there any other European countries with lesser-known involvements in the Great War? I seem to recall one of the books I read last year, possibly Frank Richards or Robert Graves, talking in fairly unflattering terms about them. I could be wrong. Well, James, you aren't wrong. There was not a very good kind of impression, really, of the fighting prowess of the Portuguese soldiers who came to fight on the Western Front. Portugal was one of Britain's oldest allies, I think possibly the oldest, and by 1917 it felt that it had to be part of the Great War, so it formed a Portuguese expeditionary force known as the CEP, and it sent 55,000 of them to the Western Front, with the first units arriving in northern France in June of 1917. They took over the sector around Neuve-Chapelle, and they pretty much stayed in that area, which was part of what today we would call the Forgotten Front, where there were no major battles taking place at that particular point, and they were holding the line, acclimatising to the Western Front. They wore their own uniforms, but they largely carried British equipment, weapons, ammunition, so they could be resupplied very easily by the British. They had a different style of steel helmet, which was kind of ribbed top to it, slightly different set of personal webbing equipment, so they do stand out on photographs, and there are quite a lot of photographs, official photographs of them, and film as well, and I have one or two postcards of Portuguese soldiers which I picked up over the years, because initially when they arrived they were trained up by British troops, and that was the kind of first interaction between the British soldier and the Portuguese soldier, and for whatever reason they were not looked at very favourably by the British soldiers who came across them. They ate quite a lot of pork and beans as part of their diet, and this became the British soldiers' nickname for the Portuguese soldiers, the pork and beans. And this was so prevalent, and the Portuguese did not like it, that an official order went round, supposedly saying that British soldiers should refrain from referring to their Portuguese allies as, in inverted commas, pork and beans. So they were trained up by British, trained in the British way of war, put into this British sector, relieving British units. So, for example, some could go up and take part in the Third Battle of Ypres. And then in March 1918, quite a few were relieved by Portuguese soldiers in that sector in northern France, so they could move down to the Somme because the German offensive had begun there. The second phase of that German offensive was on the 9th of April 1918, which became what historians eventually called the Battle of the Lys, where they attacked in northern France and crossed the border in Belgium in Flanders. And that's where the Portuguese Expeditionary Force fought its first and in many respects its last major battle of the Great War. It was holding a section of the line that came under this terrific bombardment that no unit would have been able to withstand, really, given the scale of it. And their positions were completely overrun in that sector around Neuve-Chapelle and Fleur Bay, and in that ground just beneath the Albers Ridge. And in that Battle of the Lys in April 1918, the Portuguese lost over 400 men killed in action, and 6,500 of them were taken prisoner. So essentially the CEP kind of ceased to exist for a little while, because what was left of it was then rebuilt in the summer of 1918 with new drafts coming from Portugal, not really on the scale to bring it up to what it had once been. And by the time it was ready to go back in the line, I think a lot of people think it didn't fight again after April 1918, but it was ready, combat ready, on a small scale right at the end of the conflict, and in fact took part in an attack on the Scheldt River on the very last day of the Great War on the 11th of November 1918. So it performed an important role, a tragic role in many respects when we look at the history of the Battle of the Lys. And in terms of how it's memorialised today, there is indeed a Portuguese cemetery at Neuve-Chapelle, close to where the units were fighting in April of 1918, which contains their dead from that period and the earlier period as well. But you will also find Portuguese graves in quite a few other cemeteries. If you go to Boulogne Eastern Cemetery on the coast, for example, and you come in and the British plot is on the left there, the headstones, because of the sandy soil, are laid flat, and on the right there is quite a big Portuguese plot there of men wounded up on the front line, brought back for treatment and died in the hospitals at Boulogne and are buried in that cemetery. So there's not just one burial place of the Portuguese. They are in a few different locations, but the cemetery at Neuve-Chapelle is their main point of memorial. It has a memorial chapel across the road as well. And in the village of La Couture on that Lys front, there is a memorial to the Portuguese troops as well, which depicts a kind of broken, battle-damaged building with these incredible bronze figures of Portuguese soldiers and this figure of death looming over them as well. It's very dramatic, very impressive memorial. It was unveiled in 1923 in the presence of many Portuguese veterans, and they did continue, just like their British counterparts, did continue to return on pilgrimages to the Western Front. I don't think on a big scale, but then much later there was one particular thing they could see from their trenches when they were at Neuve-Chapelle, which was a damaged Calvary, a figure of Christ on the cross. And this was then later taken back, the original one that had stood in Neuve-Chapelle overlooking those trenches occupied by the Portuguese. That was then taken back to Portugal much later, I think after the Second World War, where it's in a cathedral there. Now, there isn't a massive amount of interest in the Portuguese in the First World War, but I have come across quite a lot of work done in France. Back in the kind of pre-centenary days, there was a group in northern France that set up some information panels at different points about the Portuguese in that sector where the Battle of the Lys took place. They had an exhibition about the Portuguese that they put on one of the anniversaries of the Lys. And if you look at books by Chris Baker about the Lys, there's two very good guidebooks to it. Obviously, they feature in that story as well. So there is some material out there, and it is a fascinating element of Great War history. You ask about other European countries with lesser-known involvements in the Great War. Again, maybe that's something for another day. So I hope that's been interesting, James, and I hope that when you get a chance to go over to the battlefields of the First World War, you will get yourself to Neuve-Chapelle and go and visit the Portuguese cemetery and across to La Couture to see their memorial as well. Very worthwhile. So we'll move on to question number 3, and this comes from Ryan Ains, who's from British Columbia in Canada. He says, first off, love the podcast. I watch it on YouTube as well. So that's a good opportunity to mention that the podcast is on YouTube. Every time there's a new episode uploaded, it goes to YouTube as well. It's part of our Old Frontline YouTube channel, where there are videos on there as well, where we walk the battlefields of the Great War and we talk about Great War history. And if you've not checked out the Old Frontline YouTube channel, well worth doing. And I'll put a link to it in the show notes of this episode. So thanks for that, Ryan. And your question is, I'm curious how infrastructure has moved through the Old Front Line as you have seen it throughout your years of touring the battlefields, and if there is any consideration about this when urban planners are developing plots of land. I'm particularly interested as I had a relative killed at the Battle of Hill 70 that was never found. Rest in peace, Anthony Barrett. Well, Ryan, this is a really interesting question, because when we look at the battlefields of the Great War, they never stay the same. They are continually changing in all kinds of ways. And in the 40-odd years that I've been going there, obviously I've seen that. And when I used to speak back in the early days to people like John Giles, who formed the Western Front Association and was an author, or my old pal John Dray, or Tony Spagnoli, another Great War author, or Lynn MacDonald, or Rose Coombs, or any of these kind of people that were visiting way back to the 1950s, if not earlier in some cases, then they all had their own stories of how those battlefields had changed before I even got there. So this is something that happens all the time. And when we look at countries like Belgium, which is a fairly small nation, but has quite a high density of population, and certainly in the last few decades there's been a lot of building around Ypres. There's been commercial building with the construction of factories and commercial estates for businesses, new roads, and of course housing as well. And that has seen some areas of the battlefields being swallowed up in that. And most notably for me was 20 odd years ago in the early 2000s, when the diggers were working one step ahead of that kind of development, doing incredible pioneering work in that kind of early conflict archaeology that they were doing. They really, I think, kind of changed things. There was no real consideration, to be honest, with the battlefields of the Great War. In the 20s, they tried to blow up bunkers, they filled in trenches, they closed up dugout systems, all that kind of stuff. That was the post-war world where they were hoping to get back to some kind of normality. And the further you got away from that Great War period, the more and more of this kind of stuff disappeared or was destroyed or was filled in. And then you get to, the kind of period when I started to go in the 80s, when the First World War was not on most people's radar. It was largely forgotten. And I saw in a few short years, trenches filled in, mine craters disappeared, all kinds of things. When even bunkers were still going then. There was a big one just outside St. Julian, for example, which was completely covered over, destroyed, and can't be seen today as far as I'm aware. So really there wasn't a lot of consideration in this, but things change. And the work that the diggers did, and then the interest with professional archaeologists being involved in this kind of thing. And in Flanders, 2012, Simon Verdigam, then a young archaeologist working on his first big project, spent months excavating, surveying, studying the battlefields and the archaeology of Messines to the south of Ypres. And I think all of that was part of a sea change in this, and a connection built between construction, the role of archaeologists, the necessity to clear areas of construction of munitions, and that's something that kind of continues to this day. So I know in Belgium, archaeology goes hand in hand with development, and a privatised group of former bomb disposal officers also work to help clear sites so that any kind of development can be done in a safe way. Now in France, that isn't quite the same. France is a vast country. It is absolutely populated with archaeology from both world wars, whether that's trenches in woods through to sections of the Atlantic Wall from the Second World War all along the French coastline, through to rocket sites V1 and V2, through to massive bunkers from the First World War. I mean, you name it, it is there. And France is much more reluctant to actively preserve this stuff because they feel it could hamper development, commercial development, housing, roads, whatever it is. In France, there is this view that state projects for the greater good are just for that, for the greater good. So preserving a bunker, preserving a trench, preserving a tunnel, whatever it is not seen as kind of top priority. And that doesn't mean that there isn't archaeology, because there has been, and it doesn't mean that things are not preserved in France, because they have been preserved, but it's not done, I think, in the same kind of way, and the approach that the Belgians have in terms of actively promoting the necessity for conflict, for battlefield archaeology, is certainly not the same in France. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't take place. So, for example, now it's interesting that you mention Hill 70, Ryan, because just outside the city of Lens, which Hill 70 is close to, there's been a massive project in the last couple of years to build a new hospital, a massive area. And during that construction, they have found the remains of hundreds of soldiers from the Great War who largely fell in the Battle of Hill 70 in August of 1917, when the Canadian Corps made an attack in that area. They're not all Canadians. I believe that there are Germans amongst them, and that there are French from an earlier war period as well. But I know that conflict archaeologists have been involved in this, forensic scientists to analyse the remains, and I know that DNA has been collected, been asked for people who have relatives who were missing in that battle, so that perhaps some matches can be made to some of the human remains that have been found, and that they will then be reburied in the new extension to the Lewes British Cemetery, which we featured in an earlier podcast episode. And if you go back through the podcast catalogue, Ryan, you will find it there, and that'll give you a bit more information as to what is going on. So I've seen so many changes in my lifetime. Never good on one level, but on the other hand, the Great War was fought so nations like France and Belgium can be free to do what they wish, to live their lives, to develop, to grow, and for families there to live in houses, work on farms, build factories, whatever it is. There is that kind of level to it. But it's also sad for me to see vestiges of the Great War, kind of shadows, physical shadows of the Great War, disappear as well. And those of you who are podcast supporters will get the podcast newsletter that goes out as part of that. And I featured a story in there recently. When I went back to the Hindenburg Line on a recent trip, I went to a field near Masnieres-Cambrai, where a tiny portion of that field had just been left in its 1918 state. Just shell crater after shell crater after shell crater. And I went back there this time because I'd not been since pre-COVID, just to give it a look, just to see kind of what the state of play was, only to discover that the whole field has been ploughed up and that area of shell craters has completely gone. So that shadow of Great War history is a shadow no more. It's disappeared and will never be seen again. And that is very sad, because those kind of areas where you can see that pulverization of the ground are very, very rare on the British sector. They're much more common once you get into the French part of the Western Front, but they're rare in northern France. And there's nothing to protect a field like that, nothing at all. You could build a case for it perhaps, but I guess there's nothing to stop the landowner just going in there and ploughing up his ground. And that's exactly what happened. I don't condemn him, her. I don't blame them in any kind of way. It's possibly just they had no idea really what it was, but it's still nevertheless tragic that that kind of archaeology, that kind of remains from the First World War, can disappear just like that. And perhaps that's a warning for future generations. That younger part of our podcast audience, the 25% who are 35 years or younger, this is a challenge for you in the future, I think, as to how this kind of management of the old battlefields of the Great War is done. And that's something that I hope one or more or many of you will take up down the line. So a really great question, Ryan. Thank you for that. And if you haven't got in touch with the Commonwealth War Graves Commission about what's been found at Hill 70 and your missing relative, Anthony Barrett, then please do so and let us know how you get on. Question 4 comes from Bill on fan mail. Now, fan mail is another way of contacting the podcast. You can send a text message, basically. And I don't see your name or your number, incidentally. So if you don't put your name, Bill did, but if you don't put your name, I don't know who you are. So if you do send a question in via that method, do please put your name at the bottom. Bill, who I'm guessing may well also be Canadian, asks, you've mentioned the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry a few times in the pod. What was this unit and where did it come from and who was the princess? A brilliant question, Bill. Well, the princess was Princess Patricia of Connaught. She was British. She was born in Buckingham Palace in 1886 and was a granddaughter of Queen Victoria. Her father was the Duke of Connaught, who became Governor-General of Canada in 1911. And he was there when the war broke out in 1914. Now, the Canadian Army in 1914 was made up of militia units. It was reformed into what became the Canadian Expeditionary Force, numbered infantry battalions, Canadian engineers, artillery, medics, and so on. But there was a desire to kind of raise a regiment, I guess in the same way that Kitchener's army had been raised or was being raised at that time in Britain itself. And this is how the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry came into being. It was formed in 1914, named after Princess Patricia of Connaught. That's how the regiment gets its name. It's named in her honour. And to join it in the ranks, you had to have served in the British Army. So when we look at the profiles of the men who joined the Princess Pats, as they became known, or the PPCLI, I think PPCLI is a phrase that they didn't particularly like using, but whatever phrase you're going to use to describe this regiment, it was a unique one. So you had to have served in the British Army to join it in 1914, and when we look at their records, pretty much every regiment of the British Army was represented by the men who were in the ranks. And when I've researched some of the men who were in this unit, I have a Canadian Memorial Cross to one of the original Princess Patricias. He's a typical kind of early recruit in that he'd served in Queen Victoria's army as an ordinary soldier in the King's Royal Rifle Corps, had fought in India on the Punjab frontier and the Tirah, and then in the Boer War, so he had a chest full of Victorian campaign medals. Then he joined up as soon as the regiment was formed and went across with them in 1914. Because this regiment was formed of all these old soldiers, it was felt that it didn't need as much training. These men were already kind of ready for war. And they were then sent over as the first Canadian unit to go on active service to the Western Front in the Great War, arriving in Flanders in late 1914, just a few weeks late for the 1914 Star. The originals all got the 1914-15 Star, but they arrived first as a combat unit and then went into the trenches to the south of Ypres on the Messines front. Amongst the officers in the original officers of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry was Talbot Papineau. The Papineaus were a very well-known, very influential family. Talbot Papineau was the protege of the then Canadian Prime Minister. He got the Military Cross, one of the first MCs to officers of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, and then became a staff officer, returned to the unit later on and was killed with them in the Third Battle of Ypres in 1917. He's someone whose story I've told a few times on this podcast. I've been particularly interested in because he left behind this incredible archive of letters that he wrote to his mother. Anyway, we're kind of slightly going off the kind of track here, but in terms of the creation of this regiment, it was named after the Governor-General's daughter, Princess Patricia, formed of all these men who'd served in the British Regular Army as old sweats in the old Victorian and Edwardian Army. the first Canadian unit to go into the trenches on the Western Front as a combat unit. And there was a rumour in 1914 that the first man in the battalion to get the Victoria Cross would be given Princess Patricia's hand in marriage. That was the kind of story. And what you see when you read between the lines of what went on in the early months that it was in the trenches is crazy guys doing crazy things, trying to win the VC, but instead receiving a wooden cross rather than the bronze cross of valour. They were killed. So that story never proven in terms of its veracity, and very unlikely that a granddaughter of Queen Victoria would be marrying an ordinary lad from the back streets of a Canadian frontier town. But she did become Colonel-in-Chief of the regiment in 1918, and she went on to marry Sir Alexander Robert Ramsay, who was an admiral in the Royal Navy and related to the more famous Ramsay, who was also an admiral, and that's Bertram Ramsay, the man behind Dunkirk, Operation Dynamo, and the chief naval planner for D-Day in 1944. But the regiment itself then went on to serve in pretty much every Canadian battle. Initially, because it was the only Canadian combat unit on the Western Front, it was part of a British division. And when the CEF, the Canadian Expeditionary Force, came over and the Canadian divisions and then the Canadian Corps was formed, it was transferred into the Canadian Corps, and it served with distinction in pretty much every Canadian battle of the Great War, right up to the final day of the war on the 11th of November 1918, when it was one of the units that entered Mons in that final phase of the conflict. And you don't have to go very far on those battlefields of the Great War to find the graves of PPCLI, Princess Patricia's soldiers, scattered across those battlefields, their graves standing as memorials for all time to that special regiment formed after an English princess and named in her honour. So thanks for that question, Bill, and thanks to all the questions this week. I hope you found the answers of interest, as always, and if you want to send in a question yourself, please do so. You can do via fan mail, or you can do via the more traditional links, which is email and through our Discord server, and there's links to all of those in the show notes for this episode. See you soon for some more questions on the Old Front Line. You've been listening to an episode of the Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.